Hello? Hello everyone and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier and today we are having a look at a trio of dial indexing typewriters. These were very simple, very cheap tinplate typewriters that were produced from the 1890s all the way until the 1950s. And while during most of that period these were mainly sold as children's toys, initially these were intended as legitimate, if low-cost alternatives to regular typewriters. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Let me show you where these came from and how they work. Now, while the developmental history of the typewriter is far beyond the scope of this video, the first commercially successful model, the Scholes and Glidden typewriter, was developed in the late 1860s by Americans Christopher Latham Scholes, Samuel W. Soule, and Carlos S. Glidden. However, they failed to commercialize their design, and in 1873 it was acquired by firearms manufacturer Remington and first released on July 1st, 1874 as the Remington No. 1. Unfortunately, however, for many decades, these machines remained prohibitively expensive for most customers, selling for around $100 or more than $3,000 in today's money. As a result, many inventors came up with simpler, cheaper alternatives in order to fill this gap in the market. And the vast majority of these were what were known as indexing typewriters, meaning that you had to select the letter that you wanted right before typing it, rather than these two actions being simultaneous as in a regular keyboard typewriter. Think of the way a modern label maker works. One of the first such machines to be marketed was the Herrington, invented in 1881 by Wichita, Kansas inventor George Herrington, who incidentally also invented the spring stilt, the direct ancestor of the pogo stick. This featured a long wooden base with a vertical rubber-coated type wheel, which you rotated to the correct letter, then pushed down to type the letter onto the paper. Unlike in regular typewriters, in which the carriage and paper move past stationary type bars, in the Herrington you advance the type wheel to the next position on the paper by pressing a lever that engaged in a rack gear on the base. Strangely, the same design was also sold as the Milson typewriter by the separate Milson Typewriter Company, though why anybody thought it was necessary to create a separate company to sell the same product is a mystery. And other indexing typewriters sold at around the same time, including the Yankee, the Eureka, the Wilson, and the Ingersoll, were also of a very similar, if not identical, design. In foreign markets, the Herrington was marketed as the Universal Simplex. For example, in the UK, it was distributed by Universal Simplex Typewriter Limited of London and sold for 10 shillings and 6 pence, around £87 or $118 today. Unfortunately, however, this subsidiary seems to have overestimated the market for its products. Universal Simplex was poorly reviewed, and the company folded after only a year of operation. Around a decade later, New York inventor Arnaldo English filed a patent for what he called a new improved typewriting machine, which he was granted in 1892. His design was similar to that of the Herrington/Milton/Universal Simplex, only it used a horizontal rather than a vertical type wheel. Soon after, he, Philip Becker, and William Thompson founded the Simplex Typewriter Company in New York City. That same year, they released their first product, the Little Giant Typewriter. In 1898, Becker and Thompson were issued a patent for a simplified version of Arnaldo English's original design, which was released as, creatively, the Simplex Improved. This was followed in 1899 by the even simpler new Simplex Typewriter. Now, as I mentioned at the top of this video, these machines were originally intended to be serious writing implements for cash-strapped writers, and early versions featured nicely lacquered wooden bases, nickel-plated steel fittings, and other premium features. And I have one of these professional Simplexes here, the Simplex Special No. 1. Now, the best way of dating Simplex typewriters is to look at the patent numbers printed on the type wheel. Over its history, the Simplex company was granted U.S. patents in 1892, 1899, 1902, 1905, 1915, 1916, 1924, 1932, and 1934. The latest patent listed on this example is number 1,138,427, which dates it to 1915. However, this is not a 100% reliable method, as Simplex had a habit of integrating leftover parts from previous models into new machines. You end up with these sort of Frankenstein hybrid machines that are very difficult to date. Now, as I mentioned in previous videos, this is not intended to be a collector's channel, so we won't be going over every single one of the dozens of Simplex designs out there, just the major important models and design variations. But if you want to delve into the extensive and fascinating history of these typewriters, I have included a few collector's resources in the description below. Now, this particular model only types uppercase letters in addition to a period, comma, dash, exclamation point, and $sign. However, there were a number of models with much larger type wheels that could type both upper and lowercase letters. Now, when you press the Type key, this little spring-loaded pole engages in this rack gear on the carriage, advancing it by one space. And if we look underneath the type wheel, we can see a pair of leather pads that automatically ink the rubber type as the wheel is rotated past them. Anyway, to use this, you feed a sheet of paper into the carriage and advance it upwards by turning the knobs at the end of the feed roller. You then use your fingers to rotate your desired letter until it aligns with the slot at the top, then press on this key here to lower the type head onto the paper and type your letter. As you can see, this is an extremely slow and cumbersome process, but if you can't afford a proper typewriter, I suppose it's better than nothing. Indeed, these originally sold for only $2.50 compared to $100 for a proper Remington typewriter. Now, while dial typewriters like the Simplex initially sold well to cash-strapped writers, by the 1920s, a burgeoning second-hand market for regular typewriters significantly reduced the cost of those machines, causing the dial typewriter market to crater. As a result, Simplex pivoted and instead began marketing its products as toys for children. Indeed, the 1932 patent assigned to the company is the first to specifically identify the invention as a toy typewriter. To further reduce costs, these later models dispensed with wooden bases and other premium features. And right here I have an example of one of these toy Simplexes, the Special Demonstrated Model A. If we look at the dial, we can see that the latest US patent listed is 1,521,408, which means this was manufactured between 1924 and 1932. Overall, this is very similar to the Simplex Special No. 1, though the carriage and base are now made entirely of tin plate and cardboard, and this one even came with its original cardboard box. The mechanism is also slightly different, with the type wheel moving along the carriage rather than the other way around. And under here you can see the spring-loaded pole that pushes the type wheel along this rack gear on the carriage. Now, there were dozens of different models of toy Simplexes produced with minor design variations between each. Many of these were designed to replicate the look and feel of a proper typewriter and featured a mock keyboard with printed-on keys. Late in their production, these toys were rebranded as Star, but by around 1948 or so, they ceased production and the Simplex company went out of business. Now, among the reasons for Simplex's demise was competition from rival toy companies, including the largest one at the time, Marx Co. Founded in 1919 in New York City by brothers Louis and David Marx, this company's business model was largely based on making cheaper versions of other companies' toys that were still high quality and just different enough to avoid copyright infringement. For example, while they didn't invent the yo-yo, they were the first company to popularize it, selling some 100 million units during the 1920s. This strategy proved extraordinarily successful. Within 3 years, the Marx brothers had become millionaires, and during the Great Depression, Louis Marx & Company was one of the few companies to actually see growth. By 1938, the company held some $3.2 million in assets, around $43 million today, and employed nearly 1,000 employees globally. By the 1950s, the company had become the largest toy manufacturer in the United States, producing 1 out of 5 toys manufactured in the country. Fortune and Time magazine hailed Louis Marx as the toy king of the world and the Henry Ford of the toy industry, while in 1999 it became one of the first inductees into the National Toy Hall of Fame. However, sales began to slump in the 1960s, forcing the company to sell out in 1972 to the Quaker Oats Company, which shut down all the toy factories by 1980. Now, despite building its empire on making cheaper versions of other companies' products, Marx did produce a few original classics, including Rock'em Sock'em Robots, the Big Lou Robot, and the Big Wheel Tricycle. It was also one of the first American toy companies to adopt plastic molding technology in the face of World War II metal shortages. But the company is probably best remembered for its extensive line of brightly colored tin plate toys, which included cars, trains, wagons, buildings, carousels, climbing firemen and monkeys, and of course, toy typewriters like this one. Now, this particular example appears to be based on a 1932 patent by one Samuel Berger, who was probably the single most prolific designer of toy typewriters in history, producing dozens of designs on commission for many different companies. Now, probably the first thing you've noticed about this Marx machine is that it is considerably more complex than the Simplex. Instead of the type being mounted directly on the dial is instead connected via a gear train to a vertical type wheel, rather like a hybrid of the Simplex and the 1884 Herrington. And to type a letter, you press down on this lever and the whole dial and type wheel assembly hinges down onto the carriage. There's also a space key on the side that advances the carriage by one position. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, why is this machine so much more complex and less elegant than the Simplex despite being patented 4 decades later? And the reason likely has to do with avoiding patent infringement. See, patents protect specific details of an invention's implementation. So, for example, if the Simplex patent outright states that the type wheel is mounted to and is coaxial with the type selection dial, then no other inventor can patent a dial typewriter with that configuration without violating the original patent. And since Marx and Company's business model was based on making cheaper versions of other companies' products, inventors like Samuel Berger were forced to come up with all sorts of creative workarounds, like combining a vertical type wheel and a horizontal selector dial in order to avoid infringing on those other companies' patents. And that, dear viewers, is a brief overview of the fascinating but largely forgotten history of indexing dial typewriters. Now, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time in another video where we'll look at yet more writing implements and other fascinating devices just like these. Until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.